Chapter 6. Samson snorted in sudden alarm. The stallion's head snapped up and around as if it appeared back the way he'd come, and Jackson frowned. He'd never seen Samson react that way, and he turned his own head, staring back along their path, straining his ears. He heard nothing for several moments but the whisper of the wind, but then he did hear something. Or perhaps he only felt it, for the low rumble was so deep that it throbbed the bones of his skull. He'd never heard anything like it, and sheer curiosity held him motionless for several seconds while he concentrated identifying it rather than worrying about its source. But that quickly changed as he peered into the west and saw something. The moonlight was far too faint for him to tell what it was, but there was light enough to see that it was huge and moving. In fact, it was headed straight towards him, a stupendous black shape, indistinct and terrifying in the darkness, moving with only that deep, soft rumble, and panic flared. Whatever that thing was, it was coming from the direction of the old battle site, and if he had inadvertently awakened one of those long-dead weapon systems, oh God. Flight, this is lead. Red 1 and 2, follow me. We'll make a close sweep. Yellow 1, hold the rest of the flight at 400 kilometers until I clear for approach. Lead, Yellow 1 affirmative. Sub-flight leader Yarak acknowledged, and Uka and his two wingmen slashed upwards and went to full power to close to the objective. Jackson cursed as he scrabbled for the radio, only to drop it. It vanished into the night and the tall grass. He swore again as he flung himself from the saddle, clinging to Samson's reins with one hand while he fumbled after the radio with his other. He had to warn the steading. That's when the three bright dots streaked suddenly from the northwest, and he felt fresh panic pulse in his throat at their speed. The colony's 5 remaining aircraft were far too precious to waste on casual use. Their flights were rationed out with miserly stinginess, and none of them could move that fast anyway. But if they weren't from landing, then where? None of the 3 shuttles detected the heavily stealth sensor drone Shiva had deployed in his anti-air systems, but the Bolo himself was far too obvious to be missed. Lead 2, I'm picking up something to starboard. It looks... Uka Narsar's eyes snapped to his own tactical display, but it was far too late. Something shrieked behind Jackson and Samson reared, screaming as the eye-tearing brilliance of plasma bolts howled overhead. Sharp explosions answered an instant later. Wreckage rained down in very small pieces, and Jackson understood the stallion's fear perfectly. But despite his own bone-deep fright, he clung to the reins, fighting Samson's panic. Every nerve in his body howled to run, but he'd been flash-blinded. Samson must have been the same, and Jackson refused to let go of the horse to bolt in a blind, frantic flight across the rolling fields, which would only end in a fall or broken leg or neck. The stallion fought the bit, bucking in his terror, but Jackson held on desperately until finally Samson stopped fighting and stood trembling and sweating, quivering in every muscle. The horse's head hung, and Jackson blinked against the dazzling spot still dancing before his eyes. Then he found the bridle's cheek strap by feel. He clung to it, mouth too dry to whisper false reassurances, as he fought his own terror as the basso rebel he'd first heard headed towards him again. He could hear other sounds now. There was a squeak and rattle, and a rhythmic banging, like a piece of wreckage slamming against a cliff, and he blinked again and realized his vision was beginning to clear. The blurry, light-streaked vagueness which was all he could see wasn't much, but it was infinitely better than the permanent blindness though he'd suffered. And then he cringed, hand locking tighter on Samson's bridle, as the brilliant light flooded over him. That he could actually feel the radiant heat on his face, and his hazy vision he could make out a cliff-like vastness, crowned with glaring lights that blazed like small suns. He trembled, mind gibbering in panic, and then a mellow tenor voice spoke from behind the lights. Unit 10907 Sierra Hotel Victor of the line reporting for duty, Commander. Yarak Haller flinched as flight leader Yuka's 3-shuttle section was obliterated. The remaining shuttles were too far back and low to see the source of the fire which did it, but the explosions had been high enough to get good reads on. Hellbores. The analysis flashed on Yarak's tactical display, and he felt his muscles tighten in the fight-or-flight response the people shared with their human enemies. Yield estimates suggested the weapons in the 15 to 25 centimeter range, and that was bad. Such heavy energy weapons could destroy any of the transport ships, or for that matter, StarQuest herself, and their effective range would be line of sight. That was frighteningly enough, and yet there was worse. Lieutenant Janal's rough plot indicated the emissions cluster directly ahead was one of the smaller ones, and if something that small was covered by defenses so heavy, only the nameless ones knew what the big population center was protected by. The pilot who'd inherited the command drew a deep breath and made himself think. Only 3 shots had been fired, which indicated either that the ground battery's commander had total faith in his fire control, or else it was only 3 weapons and the defenders had simply gotten lucky, and the second possibility was definitely more likely. The humans must be as desperate to survive as the people. If the defenders had possessed additional firepower, they would have used all of it to ensure they got the enemies that they had detected. But Urak still had 26 shuttles, and if the origin point of the fire which had destroyed his CO was below his sensor horizon, he roughly knew where it had come from. Plot the origin coordinates, he told his tactical officer coldly. Then enable the missiles. Jackson Devereaux stared into the glare of light. It couldn't be. It was impossible. Yet even as he thought those things, he knew who or what that voice belonged to. But why was it calling him Commander? Who? He began, and then chopped that off. What's happening? He made himself ignore the quaver in his own voice. Why did you call me that? Hostile forces tentatively identified as Castro-class shuttles of the Imperial Malconian Navy have begun hunter-killer operations against the human population of this planet. The tenor voice replied calmly, answering Jackson's taught questions in order. And I have addressed you simply as Commander, because I do not yet know your name, branch of service, or rank. The huge machine spoke as if its preposterous replies were completely reasonable, and Jackson wanted to scream. This couldn't be happening. The Bolo he had ridden past and around and even under this morning had been dead. So what could have... The shuttles, if the Malconian units have reached Ararat, and if the Bolo had only been inactive, not dead, then its sensors must have picked up the Malconian's arrival and brought it back online. But in that case... Excuse me, Commander, but I detect 78 inbound terrain-following missiles. ETA, 9.17 minutes. It would be prudent to seek shelter. Seek shelter where? Jackson laughed wildly and waved his free hand around at the flat, wide-open plain rolling away in every direction. Perhaps I did not phrase myself clearly, the Bolo apologized. Please, remain stationary. Jackson started to reply, then froze, fingers locking like iron on Samson's bridle, as the Bolo moved once more. It rumbled straight forward, and panic gibbered as its monstrous 5-meter-wide treads came at him. Track plates 4 times his height sank a full 2 meters into the hard soil, yet that still left more than 3 meters of clearance between the tremendous war machine's belly and Samson's head, and the space between the 2 innermost track systems, which seemed to be so narrow compared to the Bolo's bulk, was over 10 meters across. And it was as if Jackson and then the sweating, shuddering horse stood in a high, wide corridor, while endless walls of moving metal ground thunderously past, and then another light glowed above them. The Bolo stopped, and a ramp extended itself downward from the new light, which Jackson realized was actually a cargo hatch. Missile ETA now 6.59 minutes, Commander, the tenor voice said, coming from the hatch above him. May I suggest a certain haste in boarding? Jackson swallowed hard, then jerked a nod, and Samson balked, but Jackson heaved on the reins with all of his strength, and once the stallion started moving, he seemed to catch his rider's urgency. Shod hooves thudded on the ramp's traction-contoured composites, and Jackson decided not to think too closely about anything that was happening until he had Samson safely inside the huge, cool, brightly lit compartment at his head. Urak Nahaler checked his time-to-target display and bared his canines in a challenge snarl his enemies couldn't see. That many missiles would saturate the point defense of a fully operable, ever-victorious class light cruiser, much less whatever salvage defenses this primitive human colony might have cobbled up. I have not yet located the enemy's surviving launch platforms, but my look-down drone's track on his missiles suggests that they are programmed for a straight-line, least-time attack. This seems so unlikely that I had to devote a full 0.66 seconds to reevaluating my conclusion, but there's absolutely no evidence of deceptive routing. Whoever commands the enemy's shuttles is either grossly incompetent or fatally overconfident, but I do not intend, as Diego would have put it, to look a gift horse in the mouth if the enemy is foolish enough to provide a direct pointer to his firing position. And I launch another drone programmed for passive-only search mode down the incoming missile's back-plotted flight path. Point defense systems fed by the air defense drones simultaneously lock onto the missiles, and optical scanners examine them. They appear to be the late generation mark of the Auger ground attack missile. Attack pattern analysis suggests that 9 are programmed for air burst detonation, and hence are most certainly nuclear armed. Assuming standard Malkonian tactics, the remaining 69 missiles will be equally divided between track-on jam, track-on radar, track-on power source modes, and may or may not also be nuclear armed. My internal optics watched my new commander, who was even younger than I had assumed from his voice, enter number 1 hold. His horse is clearly frightened, but its fear appears to ease as I close the hatch. I consider employing subsonics to soothe it further, but while comforting the beast would certainly be appropriate, it would be most inappropriate to apply the equivalent of a tranquilizing agent to my commander. These thoughts flicker across one portion of my awareness, even as my defensive systems lock onto the incoming missiles. My drone's remote tracking systems search for the enemy shuttles, and my communication subsection listens carefully for any transmission between them and their mother's ship or ships. These efforts require fully 21.23% of my main CPU capability, which under normal circumstances would be quite unacceptable. Given my present status, however, this is adequate, if not frustrating. Missile ETA is now 2.11 minutes, Commander, the tenor voice said respectfully. Jackson managed not to jump this time. He considered saying something back, then shrugged and sat on the deck, still holding Sampson's reins. I regret that I was unable to invite you to your proper station on Command Deck 1. Command 1 was destroyed by enemy action in my last engagement, but Auxiliary Command is intact. Unfortunately, it would have been impossible for your horse to scale the hull rungs to Command 2, and there is no internal access to it from your present location. If you will direct your attention to the forward bulkhead, however, I will endeavor to provide you with proper situational updates. Jackson cleared his throat. Of course, and thank you. You are welcome, Commander, the Bolo replied, and Jackson watched in fascination so deep it was almost, not quite, but almost obscured his fear as a tri-vid screen came to life on the cargo hold's bulkhead. He couldn't begin to interpret all of the symbols moving across it, but he recognized vector and altitude flags on what appeared to be scores of incoming arrowheads. Arrowheads, he realized suddenly, they were all converging on the center of the display, which made him suddenly and chillingly positive of what those innocent shapes represented. The Malkonian missiles howled in on their target. Their attack had been calculated to swamp any defenses by bringing them all in simultaneously, and the nukes lunged upward. Their function was less to obliterate the enemy, though should they suffice to do just that if they detonated, than to force him to engage them to prevent them from detonating, thus exposing his active systems to the homing sensors of all the other missiles. That, at least, was the idea. Unfortunately, the attack plan had assumed that whatever had destroyed the first 3 shuttles was immobile. Any human vehicle which had mounted such heavy weapons had also mounted at least 1 reactor to power them, but StarQuest sensors had only detected 1 fusion plant on the planet, and that one was hundreds of kilometers away. No reactor meant no vehicle, and if they weren't vehicle mounted, then they must have been part of the old manned capacitor-fed area support systems, and those were much too heavy to have been moved any appreciable distance before the missiles arrived. Sub-Flight Leader Yarek's logic was impeccable as it was wrong, for it had never occurred to him that this adversary was, in fact, a Mark 33D Bolo, which had no reactor signature simply because it had long ago exhausted its reaction mass. And because that had never occurred to him, his threat estimate was fatally flawed. The Bolo named Shiva was tracking the incoming fire without apprehension. His battle screen was operable at 95% of base capability, and no missile this light could break through it. Of course, he was also responsible for protecting the nearby human settlement, for his new commander had been bound. But though he may have lost many of his point defense weapons, he retained more than enough for his present task, and he waited calmly, weapons locked, for the missile's flight to offer them the optimum firing solution. Urek gawked at his display as the telemetry from his missiles all went dead. All of it went out, from every single bird, in the same instant, and that was impossible. StarQuest herself could scarcely have killed that many missiles simultaneously. Yet that was the only possible explanation for the sudden cessation of telemetry. He had no idea how it had been done, but he felt ice congeal in his belly, and he punched up his comm. Flight, this is lead. Come 353 true, speed 2000, now. 1 or 2 of the acknowledgements sounded surly, but he wasn't surprised by that, nor did their obvious unhappiness at running away deter him. Despite endless hours in simulators, none of his pilots, nor he himself for that matter, had ever flown combat against first-line human systems. That might make some of the others overconfident, but Ararat was responsible for their survival, not just because they were his pilots, but because their shuttles were irreplaceable, as valuable now as super dreadnoughts had once been. And because that was true, he sent them skimming back to the north and safety while he pondered what had just happened. But for all his caution, he had ordered their retreat far too late. My second drone acquires the enemy shuttles, but remains below them, hiding its already weak signature in the ground clutter as I consider its information. Were my magazines fully loaded, obliterating the enemy craft would be simplicity itself, but my anti-air missile levels are extremely low, and at the same time, the shuttles remain very close to the ground, below the horizon for my present position and thus safe from my direct fire weapons. But what's happening? My commander's voice demands my attention. I have had now ample time to conclude that he is a civilian and not, in fact, a member of any branch of the Republic's military. This conclusion has no bearing on his status as my commander. The voice impression imperatives of my crash-level restart are clear on that point, but his lack of training will require simplification of situation reports, and makes it doubly unfortunate that he is trapped in Cargo 1 rather than on Command 2. Were he at his proper station, my neural interface could transmit information directly to him, yet I feel a certain relief that I cannot do so, as he is untrained in the use of the interface as any of my other systems, and the interface can be dangerous for an inexperienced user. Moreover, the fuzzy confusion still wavering in the background of my thought processes would make me wary of exposing my commander to my potentially defective gestalt. Yet, without the interface, I must rely solely on voice and visual instrumentation, both to report to him and to interpret his needs and desires, and my internal optics show me that he has risen once more and walked closer to the display. His expression is intent, and I realize as he is noted and apparently recognized the shuttle icons which have appeared in it. The enemy is withdrawing. Withdrawing, my commander repeats sharply. You mean running away? Affirmative, Commander. But if they get away, they can come back and attack the steading again, or attack somewhere else, somewhere too far from here for you to stop them. Correct, I reply, pleased by how quickly he has reached this conclusion. Formal training or no, he appears to have sound instincts. Then stop them! Don't let them get away! Yes, Commander. I have been considering and discarding options, even as my commander and I speak. Absent proper missile armament, there is but one practical tactic. It will force a greater degree of temporary vulnerability upon me and impose a severe drain on reserve power, and it may provide the main enemy force an accurate idea of what it faces. But it should be feasible. Ararat shifted comm channels to report what had happened, and Commander Tharsk himself took his message. The flotilla CO was clearly shaken, and Ararat split his attention between flying and his commander's questions as he did his best to answer them, and because he was concentrating on those things, he never noticed what was happening behind him. Unit 1097 SHV of the line shut down his battle screen in order to channel power to his countergrav. The Mark 33 Bolo had been designed with sufficient countergrav for unassisted assault landings from orbit, but Shiva didn't need that much ceiling at this night. He needed only 12,000 meters to give him direct line of sight to the fleeing shuttles, and he pivoted to bring his undamaged starboard secondary battery to bear. Lieutenant Janal cried out on StarQuest command deck as his sensors peaked impossibly, and humans as far away as landing cringed at the fury unleashed across the heavens. 7 20-centimeter hellbores, each more powerful than the main battery weapons of most light cruisers, went to rapid fire, and the javelins of Zeus stripped away the darkness. No assault shuttle ever built could withstand that sort of fire, and the deadly impact patterns rolled mercilessly through the Melkonian formation. 9.3 seconds after the first hellbore fired, there were no more shuttles in the air on the planet renamed Ararat.